This is the Žižek Dictionary entry for Democracy by Matthew Sharpe. Slavoj Žižek's thinking with regard to political democracy is ambivalent or nuanced in several ways. It has gone through two broad phases. In his earliest works, published in English, principally The Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek appears to advocate a form of radical democracy close to the positions of Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, and Ioannis Stavrakakis. Since the mid-1990s, however, Žižek has become increasingly critical of democracy as a political regime, and democracy as a signifier around which any radical politics worthy of the name might be organized. Žižek's early advocacy of radical democracy is rooted in his wider Lacanian premises and theory of political power. According to this position, subjects' commitments to political regimes are never wholly symbolic or explicable in terms of their complete identification with the regime's symbolic ideals, like freedom, the party, the nation. This identification is rooted in what he terms a disidentification, wherein the subject abides by the symbolic regime on the basis of accepting a set of more or less unconscious fantasies about political enjoyment. Centrally, such fantasies posit some others supposed to enjoy or threatening to thieve our jouissance or way of life. Like the Muslims who George W. Bush assured us after September 2001 hate our freedoms. But one can think also of single mothers, the unemployed, new immigrants, and so on. For Žižek, such fantasies are always internally inconsistent and often factually erroneous, since they are really there to cover over the lack in our big other or symbolic order. The fact that our regime, nation, or community does not exist as a fully coherent, just, content, and solidary symbolic order. The task of a Lacanian critique of ideology, then, becomes to show how these fantasies are inconsistent, in order to attack the real, motivating foundations of subjects' identifications with them, rather than simply unmasking their symbolic ideals. In this light, the sublime object of ideology defends a radical political democracy as, paradoxically, the only political regime that can institutionalize its own lack. Following Claude Lefort, Žižek describes this in terms of democracies keeping empty of the place of power, formerly occupied by theologically or absolutely sanctioned monarchs. Thus, Žižek writes, "It is against this background of the emptying of the place of power that we can measure the break introduced by the democratic invention in the history of political institutions. Democratic society could be determined as a society whose institutional structure includes, as part of its normal, regular reproduction, the moment of dissolution of the socio-symbolic bond, the moment of eruption of the real, elections." Lefort interprets elections as an act of symbolic dissolution of the social edifice. Yet, Žižek's defense of a radical democratic position was, even in his early works, qualified by deep criticisms of really existing Western liberal democracies. In particular, from early works like Sublime Object of Ideology, Looking Awry, and Tearing with the Negative onwards, Žižek argued that the growing consumerism of Western liberal democracies after the Second World War, as against its political institutions, represents a fairly pure and powerful form of ideology. Far from allowing us to express our freedom, consumerism embodies a superego imperative to enjoy without cease, which punishes us should we fail to meet its demands. In more recent works, this critique is developed in terms of a wider critique of consumerist capitalism as post-Oedipal regime wherein the decline of subjects' faith in public, symbolic authority engenders a deeply perverse, cynical mode of subjectivity. The flip side of today's politically correct commitment to multiculturalism and value pluralism, Žižek argues, is anxiety about the over-proximity of others formerly kept at bay by shared symbolic commitments. We are hence today more subjected than ever to a host of cloying, maternal prohibitions. One can drink coffee so long as it is decaffeinated, have open sexual relationships so long as one uses contraception, smoke only in designated areas, and so on. Frustration at this political correctness and its repression of all social antagonism, Žižek suggests, goes a long way to explaining the recent decades' resurgence of right-wing parapolitics, aiming to reinstate by authoritarian means a sense of symbolic cultural boundaries. Žižek's more openly para-Marxist turn between 1997 and 1999 has seen a larger shift in his attitude, both towards really existing liberal democracies and towards radical democratic politics as a proposed critical alternative to them. Broadly speaking, Žižek has embraced a version of the old Marxist critique of liberal democracies, for which the superstructure of liberal freedoms of press, conscience, association, from arbitrary arrest, is to be considered an ideological veil. What it conceals is the way that economic liberty, the freedom to trade in markets, together with the power of money and market forces in shaping public life, undermines the other liberal freedoms or renders them effectively empty or formal, while itself being far beyond the possibility of political contestation, if not itself an avatar of the Lacanian real that always returns to the same place. This criticism of the really existing capitalist democracies has implications for how Žižek has come to understand what might truly oppose today's hegemonic neoliberal regimes. His claim is that advocacy of radical democracy is bound to remain inefficacious. Indeed, it will simply imitate liberalism's own ideological obfuscation of the determinate role of the economy, unless it politicizes the economy. As Žižek has written, "We do not vote concerning who owns what, or about the relations between workers in a factory. Such things are left to process outside the sphere of the political, and it is an illusion that one can change them by extending democracy, say by setting up democratic banks under the people's control." Yet, he complains, the cultural turn in much Western postmodern theory has insulated economics from critical and political concern every bit as thoroughly as neoliberalism itself. The depoliticized economy is the disavowed fundamental fantasy of postmodern politics. Hence, a properly political act would necessarily entail the repoliticization of the economy. It is this reason that underlies Žižek's increasingly polemical break with figures advocating radical democracy like Laclau, Simon Krishley, and Stavrakakis. Indeed, in writings since 2006, particularly around the time of the global financial crisis, Žižek has increasingly drawn upon Alain Badiou's much more hostile post-Maoist stance towards a form of nominally democratic radical politics instead of advocating for the idea of communism or even a dictatorship of the proletariat, and claiming that the name of the ultimate enemy today is not capitalism, empire, exploitation, or anything of the kind, but democracy.